Today's lesson is all about a man named Jim Crow. Now, maybe you've heard of him and maybe you haven't, but he was unfortunately super important to the development of the South at the end of the 19th century. Now, when we last left the South, the place was in shambles from the Civil War. Military Reconstruction had created occupation zones where Union generals ruled with the help of federal troops, and the whole place looked a lot like every movie about a zombie apocalypse or a game of Hungry Teenagers. When the Army got bored and went home in 1877, Southern Democrats immediately took power back from Northern Republicans. Now, depending on which side you like, these Democrats were either called Bourbons or Redeemers. Bourbon wasn't about their drink of choice, it was a reference to the Bourbon dynasty of France that retook power after Napoleon was kicked out in 1815. The Bourbons weren't the nicest group, and they were removed from power again in 1848 for the things that French royals always do, so when American Republicans called Southern Democrats Bourbons, it wasn't a compliment. However, for Southerners, these Democrats had redeemed them from Northern Republican control and, in a clever turn of phrase, called them Redeemers. They tended to be wealthy lawyers, merchants, businessmen who all believed in a very limited form of national government. So it's a good thing the Civil War happened, otherwise the South would have been left in the hands of wealthy whites who believed African Americans were inferior and hated a federal government that could tell them otherwise. Now, all this stuff, we don't still know anything about Jim Crow yet. That's because right after the Civil War and Reconstruction, there was about a decade in the South where, from a racial standpoint, things weren't really so bad. Blacks still had little economic opportunity, but so did poor whites. Black suffrage existed, and all Southern states sent black representatives to their state governments through 1900. However, beginning in the 1890s, the South embarked on a program to systematically remove African Americans from all walks of public life in the former Confederacy. Why did things change? Well, African Americans in the 1880s made some significant strides toward advancement and equality, strides that really freaked the white population out. Blacks were for the first time being educated, increasing their chances to improve their lives, and now a generation of African Americans was growing up who had not directly experienced or even remembered slavery. This made them more willing to stand up to white racists than their parents were. That was a huge problem for Southern whites who had lost the ability to own slaves but still considered blacks inferior and not really people. The word uppity got thrown around a lot. If you were uppity, it meant that you were an African American who believed himself or herself the equal of a white person, and that was something the South couldn't handle. Now, we've talked about different, not entirely legal ways to keep people from voting, including poll taxes, literacy tests, and grandfather clauses. Voter turnout across the South dropped, which meant that blacks and poor whites were ineligible to run for office, which meant no candidate spoke to their issues because there were no votes to get from them. Lynching remained a common pastime for white Southerners, and by the year 1900, in some places, one lynching was occurring on average every 3 days. While that was all well and good, white Southerners were concerned that lynchings weren't sending a strong enough message that whites should always be the people in charge. But without the laws to accomplish that directly, white Southern racists had to get more creative. The creativity of the South is shown in the phrase separate but equal. In the 1890s, whites in the South hit upon a winning solution to their problem. If whites and blacks had separate but equal facilities, that didn't count as discrimination. So schools became segregated. Each was in theory equal, but one school served the white population and one served the black population. Hotels, restaurants, bathrooms, businesses, water fountains all became famously segregated in the South. The South got a big thumbs up for this program from the American Supreme Court, when in 1896 they ruled that Homer Plessy was African American enough, 1/8, to get kicked out of a whites-only train car. The South was clear to continue separating whites and blacks and would be able to do so for another 60 years. You're probably wondering how African Americans responded to the systematic destruction of their rights and their relegation to second-class citizens for nearly a century. Those with the resources to do so could pack up and leave, and they went to northern cities where the racism was just as strong but the legal backing of segregation did not exist. So there's that. Others worked to build a separate culture away from Southern whites, which tended to be based on black churches and fostered racial pride. This enabled Southern blacks to express themselves within a context that whites couldn't stop. Some blacks in the South took the opportunity to make money presented by segregation laws, opening black hotels, restaurants, etc. Most of those simply tried to live quietly and not offend the white population, abandoning their freedom of speech and dampening their desire for equality. Some blacks were simply unable to silence themselves, though. Black leaders like Ida Wells continued the fight for equality that men like Frederick Douglass had started. Ida Wells was a South Carolina woman who wrote inflammatory articles attacking lynchings as racist and vigilante justice. In response, a mob of white vigilantes burned down her printing press, which is the strongest argument one can make in the South. Wells was once denied a seat on a railroad car because of her race, and later successfully sued the train company. That case was overturned by the Tennessee Supreme Court. Wells also worked to fund the NAACP, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored Peoples. Her influence can be seen in the name, which says people instead of the more customary men. The early civil rights movement was in many ways dominated by men, as was the style at the time. The two men who left a lasting mark on the path toward black equality were Booker T. Washington and W.E.B. Du Bois. Washington was a teacher who had been educated by missionaries after the Civil War and later went on to found Tuskegee College. He believed that equality would come slowly. As African Americans worked to educate themselves, they could then start making money. When a sufficient economic base was built, white Southerners would have to begin granting equality. Washington championed thus a slow path to equality. If you wanted a faster route, let me suggest the writings of W.E.B. Du Bois. The leading critic of Booker T. Washington, Du Bois called for bold leaders to demand immediate equality. He insisted that blacks be educated in the same ways as whites, since Washington tended to emphasize vocational education like carpentry and trade skills. Du Bois and Washington also served to showcase the fundamental split in the civil rights community that would be eventually embodied in Dr. Martin Luther King and Malcolm X. Is freedom a gradual process, or should it be demanded immediately? Now, if you're paying attention, you'll note that we still haven't really mentioned Jim Crow. Who was he? Well, he was only kind of a real person. In 1828, failed actor Thomas Rice was in New York looking for a successful idea. Having the opportunity to craft a thoughtful critique on American society, or develop an interesting new twist on American culture, he instead invented a highly stereotypical black character named Jim Crow. The only problem that Thomas Rice had was that he was white. This problem he solved by using burnt cork to blacken his face, and his minstrel show took off to great applause. From New York to Louisville, Rice performed as a singing, dancing, grinning idiot named Jim Crow, while blackening his face so that audiences got the point. And they did too, making Rice quite the wealthy man and allowing him to perform as far as London and Dublin. By 1838, the term Jim Crow was being used as a racial slur to refer to African Americans in general. Its popularity had made the character a central feature of all minstrel shows, and American audiences ate it up. Other actors would imitate Rice's imagined portrayal of an African American. Playing banjos and harmonicas, the Virginian minstrels would sit in a semicircle, tell jokes, and sing and dance like they imagined that African Americans did. While it was intended for whites to be entertained, there was a much more serious problem at hand. Minstrel shows encouraged white audiences that blacks were inherently stupid, lazy, and less than human. Taken together, these ideas justified to whites that segregation was necessary for an effective society. Thus, while lynching assaulted blacks with physical violence, Jim Crow stereotypes assaulted them with cultural violence still seen today. My question for you to consider today then is this: which is more harmful to African Americans, Jim Crow cultural stereotypes or Jim Crow legal restrictions? Using primary sources from the Ferris State University Jim Crow Museum, answer that question in a paragraph or two on this Edmodo Post.